In today's episode, I'm going to do a deep dive into the major blockbuster movies of the summer, and we're going to talk about the deeper ideas in these films. We're going to do some analysis of these films, and I'm going to go in order of my least favorite of the summer, my most favorite of the summer. So coming in at appropriately number 4 is the Fantastic Four First Steps. Now, there's a lot of things to be liked about this movie, and Fantastic Four had some really interesting insights into, I think, what is an ache of this present moment that we are living in now. For me, the strongest feature of Fantastic Four, though it was my least favorite of the films this summer, one of the strongest features of Fantastic Four for me was the way it presented, though fictionalized, it presented a post-war America that was unified in a shared story, a sense of shared culture. The way they presented New York City and American culture. This is set, I believe, in a kind of fictionalized Elseworld version of 1962. So it's somewhere between 60 and 62. You can correct me in the comments if I have that date wrong. And the way, even though this is fictionalized, the way it presented American culture at the time reminded me a lot of what I heard from my grandparents and to some extent my parents. What I heard from them about what American culture was like in those years post-World War II to leading up to the 60s when we had ideological revolutions like the sexual revolution. We also had the Kennedy assassination, both Kennedys, John F. Kennedy, Robert F. Kennedy. We also had MLK's assassination. We also headed into a largely unpopular Vietnam War. There was a massive ideological shift that was happening. On top of all of that, while it hadn't hit the mainstream yet, you had in academia and in high culture, you had the seeds of postmodernism were starting to be disseminated in our institutions of academia and in the high arts of theater and even architecture to some extent, and the arts. And so at that time, we were seeing an ideological shift, an ideological revolution that was beginning to brew in American culture. But up until that point, I think many people look back on that time period of post-war America, the 1950s to maybe the early 60s, as one of America's, if not America's, golden age. And what I saw in this film, I think a lot of people going into it, even if you were young enough, you're so young that you didn't have grandparents or parents to have lived through that era, that I think many people watching the film would be nostalgic for a kind of experience of American culture that honestly, it just is so foreign to us today. And there was something really appealing and inviting. Yes, it was fictionalized. Yes, I think one of the things that we saw in this fictionalized but yet hinted at a true picture of what American culture looked like. You saw people that were united in this shared sense of national identity, that they had a shared story, that they had a shared sense of culture, and they had a shared sense of civic duty to each other, to some higher ideal that united them. So this was really demonstrated, of course, in the way, especially in the first half of the film, the way the entire American culture and even globally, people were united behind these aspirational astronauts, the characters that made up the Fantastic Four. And it was intending to harken back to the early days of the space race. And the space race is it's a really interesting moment in American history. For a lot of people, as they look back on it, you can actually see this presented in Interstellar. So when Cooper goes to that parent-teacher conference and he's sitting there, this is set in a somewhat dystopian future where blight has struck the earth. They're short on resources. They're trying to turn everybody in the direction of being farmers to take them away from, the the great technological advancements, the reaching for the stars that came in that space race. And so he sits in the parent teacher conference, and the teacher tells him how his daughter got in trouble for bringing an old textbook which showed the moon landing. And in this kind of dystopian future, the new narrative was that the moon landing was fake. And the reason they brought up for this was, this was a conspiracy from the U.S. government to bankrupt the Soviet Union and to bring about a strong sense of national identity together. Obviously, those kinds of conspiracies float around the internet and have long been present. But one of the things this pointed to was this sense in American culture at the time of like this ambitious, pioneering spirit. And it was cool to see that fictionalized in the Fantastic Four as astronauts, as explorers, and to see the culture around them have a lack of cynicism. Obviously, there's a pivot point in the movie. I should say that throughout this breakdown, there will be spoilers for these movies. So there's a pivot point in the film where the general population, the culture surrounding the Fantastic Four in America does have a slightly cynical turn, and it's for an important reason in the plot of the story. But this was a time in American history where you did feel a sense of shared culture. And there was this sense that, the people that you saw when you walked down the street, you had a higher sense of trust. It was a higher trust society. So you have high trust societies and low trust societies. And in low trust societies, you feel like you always have to lock your doors. In low trust societies, typically the thing that only holds it together is the threat of violence. The threat of violence is what keeps people abiding by the rules because they don't have a high sense of trust for their neighbors. In a high trust society, there is something else that unifies the people together and gives them a sense of trust between their neighbors. There's this sense that I trust you. We live in a shared story that has enough shared values that maybe I could leave my doors unlocked at night. And I could walk down the street or allow my kids to walk down the street and feel confident that they were going to be treated properly. There was something very endearing about that world that the Fantastic Four presented to us. And it was very similar to the experience my grandparents told me about, in which people were less cynical. They trusted institutions more. Obviously, that institutional trust was broken, especially through the 60s and into the 70s. But there was a different spirit, a different zeitgeist at that time. And I think the movie did a good job of presenting why that was really appealing. Created a high trust society. There was a shared culture, a shared set of values. And within that parameter of we have these shared values, there was room for, yes, you can have a synagogue here. I imagine this is still a largely Christian culture, even in this fictionalized world, even though they don't have direct representation of that particular perspective directly. It really did harken back to that post-war golden age in America. And I left the theater almost kind of mourning, in a sense, what was lost. It made me think about maybe an alternative world, an alternative scenario, counterfactual of history, where perhaps the sexual revolution doesn't happen. Perhaps the far left ideological revolutions that spread through academia and often spread through high culture doesn't happen. So those are some things I appreciate about the movie. It's my least favorite. I found the moral messaging of the film to be ambiguous. It was a strange film from what's the moral takeaway from the film? In one regard, there was still this very high sense of the value of family. I think even there was an interesting way in which it dignified life in the womb. There was a kind of a device that Reed Richards had created that was like monitoring the life of their baby in Sue Storm's, last name is Storm, right? Sue Richards, because they got married. The Fantastic Four. And then she does this thing with like her invisibility powers where you can actually see the baby in the womb, which is, I mean, was very, very interesting to see that in a Hollywood film. So there's a value of family, a value of giving dignity to life, preborn life in the womb, and that I found really interesting. But the part of the story that I found a little bit perplexing was Galactus presents them with this choice, right? Galactus is the world eater of the Marvel universe, and you could see him as malevolent, but in some ways he is a representative of like non-ordered chaos. He maybe comes across as evil, and there's maybe some debate about whether or not is Galactus evil, or is he really just a representation of a personification of the forces of nature that we do have in extinction level events that have happened on our planet on several occasions, but happen presumably in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, where there's life all over on multiple planets. You would assume that there would be similar cataclysmic events, and he's a personification of that. And so when Galactus presented them with the alternative of saying, you can save your planet to the Richards family by giving us your son, they instantly rejected it. And I thought it was interesting that was presented to the audience as being like just an obvious moral fact, when I don't think that's necessarily an obvious moral fact. That it's absolutely clear that in that situation, if it really were the case that simply their sacrifice of their child would in fact secure the lives of all children on the planet, I don't think it should be presented to the audience as that being a pretty clear moral fact. Now you might say, hey, Paul, I think it wasn't presented as a clear moral fact because when the Fantastic Four arrived, and for whatever reason, Reed Richards just told the press in attendance after returning from their interaction with Galactus, and he told the press in attendance that, Galactus had told them, I will spare your planet if you give me your child, and we obviously refused. The reaction from the crowd was understandable, like, you refused. So maybe they did present some of the moral tensions there, but I just found it interesting that there wasn't much when it was presented to them. It was instantly like, no, this is obvious. We're not going to give up our child. Now, am I suggesting that they should have, that it would be morally clear that they should sacrifice their own child? I'm not suggesting that, but I think there could have been a lot more in that moment, a presentation of, it's not automatically clear what moral system you're consulting in this. So if this was a pragmatic approach, a consequentialist approach to ethics, you would have to say, Reed Richards, as a consequentialist, it's abundantly clear that the loss of your child for the sake of saving billions of children and adults and, people of all ages, that seems like a very clear moral trade-off from a consequentialist approach. Now, if it's a principled approach, a deontological approach, that for me was a little more interesting. So you'd have to be really, really clear. You'd have to establish somehow that they have a clear principle, almost Batman rule. We will never trade lives at all. So they would need to make that abundantly clear at some point. And I don't know if they had established that yet. So it seemed to me they were presenting it as some sort of principled approach that we never trade lives. Maybe it's kind of like a Batman, in the Nolan trilogy. I have one rule and I don't kill. But they weren't telling them you have to kill your child. They were telling them if you give up your child, everyone else is saved. Now, from a virtue ethics standpoint, this would become a much more interesting proposal. What is the most virtuous thing to do in this situation? And I would have loved to see them wrestle with that a little bit more. And maybe you'd say, hey, Paul, that's expecting too much of general audiences. I don't think it is at all. These sorts of ethical questions and the different sides of whether or not a principled deontological ethic works versus a consequentialist approach, whether, a Nietzschean critique of ethics is the thing that makes the most sense, that all we have is the will to power. All of that stuff was masterfully presented in The Dark Knight back in 2008, which I do believe from a box office standpoint is going to it made more money and will make more money than the Fantastic Four and Superman, adjusted for inflation. So I don't think you can simply say, well, general audiences can't get this level of complexity in philosophical debates and ethical debates. I just don't think it's true. I think you can. And good filmmakers and good storytellers have a way of bringing forth analogies in the story that people can get and still have to process with these challenging questions, because it is a challenging ethical question. If you could, it's kind of like a train track, the infamous ethical train track thought experiment. You've got one person tied to one track and you've got 15 people tied to another track, and you get to choose by pulling the lever whether the train goes over the one person over the 15. I think that's an interesting dilemma that they could have wrestled with a little bit more. But it was clear from their standpoint right away as parents, no, we are not going to do this. And then at the end of the film, again, spoilers here, the end of the film, when Galactus shows up and they've kind of used Franklin Richards, their child, as bait, I found it interesting that, they didn't actually even use him as bait. They were so committed to saying at all costs, we're going to save our child, that they put the entire planet in jeopardy. Now, I can hear the argument that goes, okay, if they were clearly aware that Franklin Richards, who in the comic books, Franklin Richards is like a god level character. He can create and destroy universes and galaxies with just his thoughts. He is a S tier character in power. So I could hear the argument that them going, well, if it meant Franklin, and we know what he's capable of, is then going to be used by Galactus or used for some nefarious purpose that's going to lead to the destruction of so many more worlds, I can hear that, and that would totally make sense. But it was clear they didn't understand his power. They didn't understand. And so from their vantage point, all they're saying is, we think our child is worth potentially all of your lives. I don't know if that should be a clear, obvious ethical message that's presented. I think the other part of it that I found challenging was the way that the film hinted at both a kind of World War II sense of civic duty as they were preparing for Galactus's invasion, with worldwide unification instead of just like allied unification. The sorts of things that we saw in World War II with like food rationing, with intentional power outages, especially in Great Britain when they were when the German Luftwaffe bombers were bombing London by night, and they were trying to get everybody on board, kill the lights, we're going to kill power. They hinted at that, but I also couldn't help but think of the ways in which this connected, especially as they made it a global phenomenon. It connected to the pandemic years in some ways that I felt was potentially interesting or convoluted messaging. It was hard not to think of the messages that came across our televisions all over, from celebrities, the clear, unequivocal, you need to sacrifice for the good of all. And I think there's something powerful in that. But here's where the moral conundrum came up for me in Fantastic Four, was that if you looked at the Richards as the figureheads of institutional trust, if you looked at them, and I hate to use this, I don't mean this in a pejorative term, if you looked at them as a symbol of the elites in culture, and you said there was a time in which the elites in our culture really did care and serve those at the very bottom of the status ladder. And you were reminding people of that. And maybe it was a movie that was calling those sitting in positions of more elite status, highly educated, in positions of elite influence, to say, remember that time in which you stood for something, you had clear ethical standards, you were virtuous, your job, with your immense intellect that you've been blessed with, or you're blessed with being in this particular status in life, your job is to serve and to care for all. Awesome. But the thing that it seemed to message, which I found myself at struggling with, was when there was the worldwide call, and it was the Richards family telling people, turn off your lights. And of course, they were following along with this as well. Turn off your lights, save energy, all of the kind of World War II stuff, but also hints of the pandemic years. I still wrestled with the fact that they were calling everyone else to make immense sacrifices. Sacrifices that we saw during those difficult years, where it was like, hey, we're going to forbid you from leaving your home. And that's fine if you have like a white collar job where you can work from home. But if you were deemed non-essential and you couldn't go into work, you lost your pay. So the rationing, the shutting off, the we all have to get on the same page and all of us need to sacrifice. It was an interesting moral message to see that the Reeds themselves weren't willing to sacrifice their child, which still from their vantage point would have guaranteed that everybody in the world was going to be saved. And yet they were calling the world to sacrifice in ways that I don't think the movie drew attention to the realities of, okay, so when we start rationing food or we start saying there's a mandated curfew and lights are out, what happens to the person that works the overnight shift? What happens when you say you can't work? What happens to the low-income person who works for the electric company, right? They work for the power plant. And because of these demands placed on them by the people at the top, they've lost income. And you're going, Paul, like, it's just a comic book movie. Maybe we shouldn't think so deeply about this stuff. But we've seen the ways superhero movies can address this stuff. And this stuff does get addressed in the source material. The source material, comic books and graphic novels, there's a long history of them presenting complex moral questions in a way that is really interesting and fascinating. So it wasn't clear to me that the message was unequivocally the Fantastic Four are bastions of moral virtue, that even in their positions of being the elites in this movie, they use their position to clearly serve. They always do what's right. They are willing to make the sacrifice. I don't know, that message seemed ambiguous to me. From an execution standpoint, it's probably just my least favorite of the four. All right, the next film to talk about here, so this would be my third place finish, was the new Jurassic Park movie. Maybe it helped coming into this that I didn't necessarily have high expectations. The Jurassic Park series that had Christopher Pratt in it, the first one was all right. It feel like it, I don't know, did they do 2 or 3 with him? I can't recall. And they seem to have, well, because I can't recall, they seem to have deteriorating quality with each one. And the last one was the most, for me, just convoluted mess. There were things I appreciated about this movie. And, I'm not a film critic, so I won't focus on necessarily traditional film critic stuff. But I do have to talk about the visual aesthetic of the movie, because it does seem like, from a cinematography standpoint, they prioritized a presentation of beauty in the natural world, even though obviously it's a fictional world. They presented a compelling and had several moments of intentionally calling the audience to just appreciate physical beauty, the beauty of the natural world, even though this natural world has dinosaurs in it. there was something about that I appreciated. There was that scene where they were in like the really tall grass, and then some big, this probably isn't the technical term. I'm using the terms from like elementary school that I remembered. The brontosaurus, there were brontosauri in the tall grass, and the characters were filled with awe and wonder, and they slowed down. They slowed down the pace of the movie enough to do something that you saw in the very first Jurassic Park movie. The thing that when I was a kid really like kind of took my breath away, especially in those early days of CGI, where those characters pulled up in one of the Jeeps, right? And I'm forgetting now that both the characters' names and the actors' names, aside from Jeff Goldblum, who were in the original Jurassic Park film. And they have a moment of just being spellbound in wonder. I appreciated their presentation of that they slowed the pace down. This is a big budget box office film. You should expect action all the time, plenty of action, but they slowed down to show just an appreciation for wonder. And that was one of the things I appreciated most about the film, was them showing like what should motivate scientific inquiry, what should motivate our drive to make and display beautiful things, and it is the sense of wonder. And wonder is closely associated with the experience of awe. What is the religious impulse? The religious impulse is to seek and pursue what should be of ultimate concern. What should be of my highest concern? What is worthy of my highest attention? And so the religious pursuit has the religious impulse first of awe, wonder, right? It is to say there are things beyond me. I don't have it all figured out. My framework, the frame in which I see the world, is incomplete. And so the experience of awe is similar. Awe is in many ways the predecessor to metanoia or repentance. Awe is the experience of going, the frame in which I see the world is not complete. And metanoia is the Greek word metanoia means to change your mind. It's the Greek word throughout the New Testament associated with what we see in our English translations as repentance. English translations in the Bible as repentance. Metanoia is to change your mind. And what produces a change of mind is a change in our framing. We see the limitations of our framing. That can be because of what we might say in the theological language is the presence of sin, which mars our perception of reality. We do not see things as they are because of sin, because of selfish pursuits, because of maybe even the presence of sin around us. We have been impacted in such a negative way that we get into fight or flight because we feel like all around us is a threat. And when we see all around us as a threat, it limits our sense of wonder. We cannot wonder in that state of fight or flight because we are just in a mode of self-preservation. So at times it can be the presence of sin that mars our ability to see. But sometimes it's just our finitude. And our finitude is inherently good in the Christian tradition. We are created finite. We have the image of God within us, but we are created as finite beings intentionally. And that finitude is for our good. But being finite doesn't mean that we aren't invited into a journey of expansion of wonder, of expansion of our frame, to see beyond where we are. And I would say in the Christian tradition, there's a couple of words to describe that process. We have, which is still words that we hear throughout the Eastern tradition, and that's the language of theosis. Theosis is the continual journey into greater and greater union with God. It's the continual expansion of our frame to see things from a more complete perspective, to have our heart and what we go, this is what is of my deepest concern, be aligned with what is ontologically of ultimate concern. What we have as our inward pursuit come into increasing alignment and say, what is of ultimate concern to me is what is ultimate. So wonder helps open up our frame to go, what is ultimate? And I really appreciated that scene in particular. There were some other things I also appreciated about Jurassic Park. I don't like it as much as the first one, Debatable whether or not, the first or second in the kind of original trilogy, whether the second or even the third one would be better than this one. Some of the things I appreciated about it were there really seemed to be, and I believe Gareth Edwards directed this, who also did Rogue One. There really seemed to be an intentional incorporation of Spielberg like elements. For me, the strongest moments of the film, things that lost me, were like when Scarlett Johansson's character and I don't know, one of the other characters were like kind of like telling the audience about their backstory. That stuff rarely makes for a compelling film experience. What was far more compelling for me was, and I think they could have just started the movie with the family that was sailing out in I guess it's the Pacific. I don't know. Maybe, I don't know if they were, because I don't know my Jurassic Park geography, where these islands were that they were going, whether they were in the Pacific or the Atlantic. It started just with this family out sailing. And of course, they come across some Jurassic age or earlier than that creatures in the deep that end up tossing them over the boat. And you don't get a lot of exposition there. You get just it was show, not tell. And I thought they could have started the movie right there. And there was a lot of Spielberg-like elements with the way in which the movie did at times show and not tell. And I thought it was strongest around that. This other Spielberg elements with even like the little girl in the family finding a little dinosaur, and you find that little baby dinosaur to be endearing. I thought it moved in a way that once you kind of got past some of the narrative exposition at the beginning of the film, which honestly was bland and boring, I don't know, it didn't add anything to the story to me. That it moved to just being kind of an experience of sight and sound. I thought there was a lot of value in that. And that gets to one of the interesting things about cinema as an art form, and it being different than reading a book or listening to a lecture. I think about a movie like, the Indiana Jones movies. Until like the last Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, you had no idea about Indiana Jones's backstory. And I think we've become strangely obsessed, maybe because of social media and the way in which when a movie comes out or a television series come out, that people will start to speculate about character backstories. Even before the age of social media, I remember, I remember the character of Boba Fett in Star Wars. They gave no explanation for who that character was, no backstory explanation. And it was fun. When you got together with your friends, you would kind of create your own headcanon, or you think about, like, well, who is this Boba Fett character? Like, where did he come from? And I think some of that is just best left as discussion for after the movie, or just your own imagination to explore. The strongest points of Jurassic Park for me were when they were really just tapping into those Spielberg elements, that kind of Indiana Jones, you don't need to know the backstory. Just give me a moment of conflict where the person's character is revealed in the conflict, and the story moves and the stakes increase. And there's a demonstration of the character's character and the progression of their character arc just through the experiences. So that was, for me, some of the weaker points of Jurassic Park, was when it told you, like, Scarlett Johansson had some like sad backstory that she kind of just awkwardly told another character. I can't remember. I saw this a while back. And I don't know. I didn't feel a stronger emotional connection to them. I felt the family connection was stronger, and they had less exposition about that. They just showed it. So a lot of things I found interesting, visually compelling. The sense of wonder in Jurassic Park, for me, is one of the strong points of that series. There's kind of quasi horror elements as well, which are fascinating. But yeah, so I'd place Jurassic Park in third place on my list. In second place, I've got the new Superman movie, and I've already done a lengthy lengthy conversation with Parker Settecase of Park Notes and Parker's Pensies. So you can find that link below in the description if you wanted to listen to the full conversation between Parker and I, where we explored those themes. I put Superman in second place. Now I have to confess, I'm going to start because when I talked with Parker, I talked about the things I liked first, and I want to start in this video with just acknowledging, putting my cards on the table. I hinted at this, and I think I maybe explicitly said this in talking with Parker. I'm not a big James Gunn fan, so this movie would have been higher on my list of just personal preference if I had a stronger personal preference for James Gunn's style of movie and his storytelling experience. It isn't my thing, and as just a movie goes, I don't think this is anywhere near the ballpark of something like a Dark Knight or even a movie like Logan, the Marvel movie starring Wolverine's character in his later years of life. I find that to be a much more compelling movie. It's nothing compared. And when I see these Rotten Tomatoes scores, I go, this is really interesting. If you put that up for me against, like, just this past weekend, I rewatched Interstellar, which is one of my favorites. If you put this up against like a Christopher Nolan movie like Interstellar or Oppenheimer, from just a movie, from a cinema standpoint, if I was just a reviewer, I would say that's not even in the same ballpark. Why I put it in second place is because I think it's an important cultural film for the masses. As I've been talking about for years, and even specifically with this movie, before the first trailer came out, and you can go back and see back in November of 2024, before the first trailer came out, I was talking about what I was anticipating for this movie, in particular with how it handled the character of Superman. And in our meta-modern vibe shift, as we've been moving beyond postmodernism, not deleting it, but moving past our postmodern cynicism, our suspicion, our obsession with the deconstruction of overarching stories, our obsession with foregrounding the anti-hero as the real hero, the person that sees through, that exposes the Homelanders. Our obsession with all the dark Superman archetypes, from the Homelanders to Omni-Man to the Injustice Superman. I really felt that we were at a point of cultural exhaustion with that. And as much as I did enjoy Man of Steel. And I know there's going to be divisive comments about this. I really enjoyed Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, the Ultimate Edition, as just a movie. I thought what they were attempting to do, while I prefer this David Cornsweet Superman, I thought what Snyder was trying to do was do his best to show the audience the tensions that we have in a more postmodern culture, in a post-Watchmen culture. Of course, Zack Snyder did the film adaptation of Watchmen. That in this Watchmen world, where we're actually really suspicious of our heroes, that Superman trying to exist in that kind of world would be really, really difficult. So I have a high appreciation for those movies, while at the same time acknowledging I think it was the right move. Snyder fans, I know you have strong feelings about those movies, so please hear me about this. I think from just reading the cultural moment, I think Zack Snyder's plan, which was for like as Justice League 2, to have Superman come under the influence, the anti-life equation, under Darkseid's power, and to really get another truly evil Injustice Superman like they showed at the very end of Zack Snyder's Justice League, to go in that direction, I think would have really missed the spiritual longing of the cultural moment. And I will give James Gunn credit. What he was able to rightly attune himself to in the cultural moment was this longing for wholesomeness, for sincerity. I think the meme that's kind of going around, the tagline that's going around, which I don't think was ever quoted directly in the movie, was "Kindness is the new punk rock." That wasn't a direct line from the movie. I actually think it's better to take the line that David Cornsweet Superman had in his interaction with Lois Lane, who was kind of, she represented the more cynical, the perspective of millennials, younger Gen X, and digital natives and Gen Z who have been raised in the culture of cynicism. She represented that perspective. And then the realization, sitting in front of this just brutally wholesome, painfully sincere Superman, was that maybe his perspective was the real countercultural one. I think James Gunn had his antennas up and was rightly reading the moment. And there's some things we can trace, and we have traced before, to show that our culture has increasingly been longing for more and more of this, longing for the wholesome, longing for post-ironic sincerity. This Superman was, and I made this prediction long before the first trailer, that what I was anticipating, if Gunn was reading the cultural moment well, was I was anticipating a Superman that would be a mix of Ted Lasso, Waymond from Everything Everywhere All at Once, where in that movie, the real revelation is that Waymond is the real hero of the film. His relentless kindness, the thing that makes him look weird and out of touch with the rest of reality, with the rest of culture, his sincerity, his looking on the bright side of things. In the end, that his perspective is shown to be the one that the audience they're invited to embody as the most heroic. So you take that, you take a Ted Lasso, you put that together, you put him in a blue suit with a red S on his chest, you give him a cape. And that's really what David Corenswet's Superman was. Kind of nerdy, even not just in his Clark character persona, in his Superman persona. He's painfully sincere. Hints of even like a Joe Pera from Joe Pera Talks With You, which very early on, I think Joe Pera Talks With You on Adult Swim came out in 2018, somewhere around 2018. That was, for me, one of the first signs that I noticed in pop culture of this pivot was Joe Pera's comedy, and often the comedians are on the front edge. A guy by the name of Jonathan Pajot that some of you are maybe familiar with, he's often said over the years, pay attention to the fool, look to the court jester, look to the comedian, the one that's kind of willing to say what might be out of fashion. They can get away with it because they bring it in a humorous way. Pay attention to them. Joe Pera was on the front side of this vibe shift. So you see that, you see it Everything Everywhere All at Once, and Waymond's character, you see it Ted Lasso. And then you sprinkle in, a Maverick from Tom Cruise, that aspirational sense of heroism. James Gunn also pointed to that movie as one of the inspirations for their tone and even what they wanted to do in some of the Superman flight scenes. So I really appreciated that. I appreciated the message. The execution of the movie, the tone of the movie, it's just not my thing. I mean, it reminded me a lot of kind of the Joel Schumacher Batman movies. Reminded me a little bit of like Wonder Woman 84, which I think that movie was brutal from a moral messaging standpoint. Just very, very convoluted moral messaging there. This didn't have that. I felt it had clear moral messaging, and I feel like it had a message that is really moving now from the front end of the bell curve in the zeitgeist into kind of moving more towards the middle. This vibe shift towards sincerity, towards being post-cynical, which isn't naive, post-cynical, post-ironic sincerity. I felt it did that in a really, really interesting way. And the other thing I thought was interesting about James Gunn's twist in the movie, in having Kal-El, Superman's Kryptonian parents, actually kind of sending him as kudos to Parker for mentioning this in his essay about the film. They sent him almost in kind of like a Dragon Ball style mission, as the Saiyans sent Goku or Kakarot to Earth to conquer the Earth. That, there's kind of almost like a Dragon Ball element here to the way Gunn takes the Superman origin story and twists it, and shows that Superman was actually sent to Earth to conquer it, to have a harem of women. Some social Darwinism stuff. There's a real Nietzschean Ubermensch message there from his Kryptonian parents that he never heard. So one of the more fascinating components about this film for me, which I kind of have to import some of my comic book knowledge to make these connections, was it makes you go, okay, so if that was what he was sent here for, shouldn't that be his identity? And no, it isn't. So what made his identity? And the clear message by the end of the film was, who shaped Superman's identity were his parents from Smallville, Ma and Pa Kent. And while they don't explicitly say this in the film, the only conclusion you can come to for the Superman character being the moral virtue, the moral exemplar that he is, his relentless commitment to virtue. The only reason why that makes sense is because Ma and Pa Kent are Christians. They are heartland American Christians in particular. It's revealed in Action Comics. You'll have to read my weekly newsletter from a couple weeks ago. I don't have it in front of me, but it's explicitly revealed at some point in Action Comics. I forget what number, that they are Methodists. And we also know from the comics that young Clark Kent, was taken to church as a boy, that his parents prayed for him. They instilled in him a Christian commitment to caring for the least of these, for using his power to serve, for using his power instead of conquering, to serve and care for the least, and to serve even and care for creation in the act of even saving a pitiful, non-essential squirrel from a giant kaiju. Some people didn't like that scene. I thought it was an interesting insight into the kind of character that this hero was. That only comes about because of the formational inputs in young Clark Kent's life by his Christian parents. Now, obviously, in the movie, Pa Kent says to him, "Hey, it's going to be it's your decisions that define you." And, Parker and I had some discussion about that, and I'm okay with that message. I know some see it as kind of radical existentialist message. You make yourself what you are. Maybe it's a radical self-authoring message. I saw it more as, we have been your moral exemplars. We have been your Christian parents. We've taken you to church. We've prayed for you. We have pointed you towards Christ as the highest, ultimate moral exemplar. And now we are setting you out into the world. And any parent knows this. You can't control your kids' actions. And as they transition into adulthood, the only thing you can really pray for is all of those inputs, that when they come to key moments of decision, that something will have been instilled in their character enough that by the time they get into their adult years, their character will desire the good. Their appetite will desire the good instead of evil. So, obviously some things that I would do differently, but I would still place it as my second favorite movie of the summer for the reasons I've just mentioned. My favorite film of the summer, and I was not expecting this one when I was going into the summer. I wasn't expecting this one to be on top of my list. I didn't really have much expectations for it at all. My favorite film and the number one spot for me this summer is F1. I loved F1. I loved it. I don't watch Formula One racing. I've never really watched. I'm not a NASCAR guy either. That's not my world. So I didn't come into it with this high appreciation for Formula One racing that just was like, I love this for those reasons. I loved F1 for a number of other reasons that go far beyond like really well shot race scenes. I found that really cool and compelling. What I loved about F1, and I wrote about this for Perfectus magazine several weeks ago, it was the spiritual successor to Top Gun Maverick. It was sincere storytelling done well in a post-ironic age. It was refreshingly earnest. It was earnest all the way through. It was emotionally direct. There was no postmodern irony. There was no cynicism. There was no deconstruction of the values of the past. It was free of all that stuff. And it's just so refreshing. It was just done in such a way. It was free of political preachiness. Most Americans do not like that. Again, I've talked about this. I wrote about this in my piece for Perfectus magazine. Several years ago, Time magazine did a survey in which they found 70% of Americans dislike or do not feel that a political message improves the quality of a movie in any substantial way. Most Americans don't like political preachiness of any kind. In the same way as a guy growing up in the evangelical subculture of the 80s and 90s and the development of all these Christian movies, I didn't like when I was sitting in a Christian movie and felt like I was being preached at in my own value system. And the reason why is like explicit preaching at the audience treats the audience as dumb. It's like it treats them as people that deserve to be lectured. If I want to learn about something, I will willingly pursue it. Or if you want to just tell a beautiful story that has beautiful presentation of particular values, we are smart enough to make those connections via the narrative. We don't need to be preached at. So there was no political preachiness in F1. It was free of culture war agendas. This did not pit characters who were black and characters who were white against each other. It didn't pit certain ethnicities as being inherently superior because they are on top of the matrix of oppression hierarchy, or certain ethnicities as being inferior. It didn't do any of that. One of the things I also appreciated about this, and this is a continuation from what we saw in Twisters as well, the Twister sequel, that was another unexpected hit back in 2024, was the way it presented a view of masculinity and femininity as complementary. And it didn't present a really masculine character, Brad Pitt. It didn't present him as being completely free of any character flaws. He clearly had character flaws that he was working through in the course of the movie, but it didn't present him and his masculinity, his propensity for risk taking, his willingness to be a high achiever and to go hard after his goals. It didn't present that as inherently being toxic, and it didn't present his female counterpart, Kate McKenna, I believe is her name. Yeah, I think that's her name. I don't know. You guys can correct me in the comments. I'm doing this without notes here. Kate McKenna, she's not presented as either being merely just like an object for him. She's not just the object of male gaze. Obviously, Brad Pitt's character Sonny is attracted to her, and obviously there is a a kind of more than just hinted at. There's a clearly implied like sex scene. I appreciated. I didn't need to see all of that. I just don't know who does when you go to a movie theater need to see like an explicit sex scene. Yeah, that I'm not saying that as a prude. I'm just saying it as like, it's just awkward sitting around people watching this. So they hinted at that. Obviously from my perspective, I would prefer like even a higher sexual ethic than be presented than just a like a one night stand hookup. So not wild about that, but they didn't present his character as being just simply objectifying her. And then they also didn't do the thing, which has been kind of the common trope for decades almost now, the common trope of the way we present the strength of femininity is by having it simply mimic high testosterone masculinity. So she's not doing the like female Rambo thing. She's not doing like the female John Wick thing. She doesn't have to show her strength by being like, I'm the biggest boss in the room. I have to make myself large. I have to be, I have to be the one to boss people around. I have to be the one that wields a gun or a huge sword. I have to be able to kick people's butts. There's a different kind of feminine strength, and I thought it was presented in this movie well. The strength of her intelligence, the strength of her ability to care and present caring in such a way that the team grows by her ability to use her femininity in such a way to help the masculine egos pursue a shared goal together. She didn't give them lectures. She didn't condemn them, but she had a very clever way of getting them to direct that towards a higher potential for good. And I thought that was a brilliant way of presenting masculinity and femininity that doesn't make it a zero-sum game. This isn't like, femininity has to win at the cost of masculinity. It's not masculinity has to win at the cost of femininity. It is that we need these complementary, we could even say like complementary forces. I'm largely in agreement with C.S. Lewis on this, who's maybe importing kind of the idea of masculinity and femininity as almost like Platonic forms, that there's something deeper than just biology here. There is a masculine spirit, there's a feminine spirit, and I'm largely in agreement with C.S. Lewis on that. And it takes the form of biology. And so we have this like spiritual complementary thing that happens here when the masculine and the feminine cooperate, and there is mutual self-sacrifice in the process. There's a mutual, it's not I am losing all of myself, but I am intentionally constraining. This is the idea of kenosis, of self-emptying love. It is the idea of intentional, voluntary, willing dissent. It is, I am showing my strength by my ability to constrain my strength. I am showing how strong I am by intentionally limiting myself. I'm voluntarily doing that for the good of another. And so what happens is when you do that and I do that, when man and wife does that, male and female does that, I am voluntarily limiting. You're not forcing me. I'm not forcing you, but I see in you something that draws out my desire to limit the elements of my masculinity, which might be in this nature I've inherited, directed towards ends which are not for my good and not for the good of others, that I see in you something that calls me higher. And the higher calling invites me to cast off things. That's the constraint. I am getting rid. I am voluntarily shedding the things which would not lead to your good. The other thing I really appreciated about F1 was the way that it addressed the flow state and how the flow state allows us to pursue deeper states of meaning and existential satisfaction than the pursuit of ego and status. And I think what we saw in Sonny's character arc was how, as a young man, he was mistakenly pursuing status when what he really wanted in his pursuit of excellence, so the pursuit of excellence for him, what he really wanted was excellence that allowed him to continually progress in his craft so that he could increase his challenge high enough to enter into what Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, the Hungarian psychologist, coined as the flow state. The flow state is this state of consciousness where we are challenged slightly beyond what our comfort level is, but not too far beyond where we enter into a state of stress. It is a stretching of our capabilities. It can happen in playing a musical instrument, a sport. You could get into the flow state as a bean counter. You could get into the flow state if you are, if you do people's taxes and it's just the thing that lights your brain up and you get into the flow state. You can get into it as a writer. You can get into it as a public communicator. You can get into the flow state in a range of things. You can be gardening and get into the flow state. All it requires is a goal that you intrinsically feel is worth pursuing and a challenge that tests your capabilities in such a way that it pushes you beyond your comfort zone, but doesn't push you so far beyond your comfort zone that it is so far beyond your capabilities that you enter into a state of stress. What Sonny's character realized by the end of the film was what he was really after, and he describes it as the experience of flying. What he's really describing there, and it's beautifully portrayed in the very end of the film, is he is pursuing a flow state experience. He wants to achieve more. He wants to push his capacity, but not necessarily for the achievement of status, another trophy, because it's really cool. Once he wins in the final race, and everybody else is partying, he moves on to his next challenge, which I think is like dune buggy racing or something like that. I can't remember what the vehicle was. It ends up on a beach. It's a new thing. It's something else that could stretch his capacity and increase his challenge. And I think that's a brilliant portrayal of how vital flow state experiences are to our sense of meaning in life. Plenty of research has been done in Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's book, Flow. This has been corroborated throughout the years that people that have increasing flow state experiences in their days, their weeks, their months, their years, the more frequently you experience the flow state, the higher people report levels of existential satisfaction and a sense of meaning in life. So as you have more flow state experiences, it's a signal. You feel like I'm doing the thing that I'm supposed to be doing. Now, where might this connect to deeper ideas in theology and philosophy? I think there's a long tradition among the Christian mystics, um, desert fathers, the modern mystics, of entering into a place of prayer where our attention is rightly ordered in such a way that we would get into something that we could call the flow state. And you can get into that in prayer. You can get into that into an experience of worship in the context of Christian community, where we have group flow state experience. We're all experiencing this together. Now, is it simply reducible to what we're having in that moment is just simply a flow state experience and not the experience of God? I don't think we need to bifurcate the two. The flow state experience does something to order our attention and hyper focus our attention in a direction which we can't normally enter into in our normative framing. So what we can learn to do is we can direct our flow state experiences towards that which is worthy of our attention. And worship is about rightly ordered attention. Religion, the religious pursuit, is about what is worthy of my highest attention. What is worthy of my most, what is that which should be of my highest concern? And so when we have that rightly ordered, the flow state assists us in our ability to rightly order our attention in things that are worthy of our attention. Can you get into the flow state in things that aren't worthy of your attention? Absolutely. You could certainly, I could imagine you could get into the flow state doing a range of things which actually maybe could harm your neighbor. It could actually lead to evil in the world. It's possible. But I largely think that as a standard, a good measure of figuring out what sorts of things might I be called to in life. And if you're struggling with things like, let's say depression, for example, my colleague Clay Rutledge has done excellent research at the Human Flourishing Lab on what we might say are like outward facing therapies that take us beyond just cognitive behavioral therapy, meeting with a therapist, a counselor, to deal with like depressive symptoms. Because one of the things that can happen is that rumination, the more people ruminate and the more people navel gaze, the more it actually increases depressive symptoms. There's a strange trade-off there between, I want to address the things that are going on in here, but the more I ruminate, the more I navel gaze, actually the more it increases those depressive symptoms. I think Clay has done really interesting research, and it's something we hope to do more of together in the future, exploring the ways in which those outward facing, if I can get out and serve, if I can find something outside myself that's worthwhile, if it's something that could lead to the flourishing of others, and I can get myself in such a place that I experience flow, kind of loss of time, that full immersion in the thing, man, that's a beautiful, absolutely beautiful experience. So for some of you, that might be a musical instrument, and you need like an outlet for that musical instrument. You need to find a place to serve the world around you with that gift. And when you get into the flow state in that gift, it increases. You feel like, I mean, it's like Steph Curry when he gets into the zone. People can experience that on the guitar or the piano or the drums or the organ or the violin. They can experience that. And what ends up doing is when you get into the flow state and it's directed towards the good, which leads to the flourishing of others, you maximize the potentiality of that moment, your attention being rightly ordered. And in that state, without even being as conscious of it as you could be, you lose that self-consciousness and you start doing something that immerses you in a maximally beneficial experience for yourself and for others. That's where it's at, y'all. And I love how it highlighted that. I think there's a way in which, Sonny's experience of pursuing the flow state can really, really be integrated into a Christian spiritual formation, a Christian theology of worship and liturgy. Because what I'm ultimately after is rightly ordering my attention towards that which is worthy of my attention. And as we've talked about already, I want to match what inside of me is saying, this is worthy of my attention, to what is ontologically of ultimate concern, which is God. And so as my attention goes through processes in which the things that are not rightly ordered about it become into greater alignment and greater order, I experience more of what we could call the fruits of the Spirit. love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, meekness, gentleness, self-control. I experience more of the things that lead to the flourishing of others around me. And so what I would encourage you all to find is to find those things in your life, whatever it may be, whether it's woodworking, find a way that the thing that you do that can benefit other people allows you to have more and more flow state experiences. And one of the things that we must learn about this is the value of discipline, because discipline is the thing that allows us to stretch beyond our current capacity, to increase our capacity, to be able to perform well in those moments. So as a public speaker, I have plenty of areas that I can grow in. But as I increasingly challenge myself and I put myself in situations which heighten the challenge, my capacity expands. Doesn't always happen right away. Sometimes I'll put myself in situations, I may explore a topic, or I may have a public speaking engagement where I say, I'm going to rely less on my notes here as a higher challenge. And I go, yeah, I relied less on my notes. Maybe I had more eye contact with the people in the room here, but I don't feel like I clearly communicated as clearly, right? Even in this video, I'm not running off of a script here. So there's a trade-off there. The trade-off for me is that I might misspeak, as I just did right there. That trade-off comes at the cost of going, what I'm trying to expand in my communication is I can have some trade-offs for my aptitude and nailing precisely every single word I want to say, for hopefully a sense of more humanity and warmth. I don't want to sound like an AI. So as I challenge myself and I discipline myself more and more to put myself in those experiences, and I fail at times, it is opening up the possibility that the next time, as I have increased that challenge, I've moved beyond my state in which I was, in which that was my ceiling. I've gone slightly beyond it. And maybe as I've slightly expanded that, I've increased my capacity for more flow in my life. And if I can direct that towards activities which lead to the benefit of others and lead to the flourishing of others, that's where the sweet spot's at. So I loved F1. That's on the top of my list for me. I would love to hear your list. Certainly there were other films that came out this summer that you might have said, hey, this would have been worthy of review. In the comments below, I'd love to hear, if you've seen all four, how would you order all four? What deeper ideas and themes did you see present in these films? Tell me where you agreed with me. Welcome to hear where you disagreed as well. And thanks for watching. My weekly newsletter, Reading the Zeitgeist, my podcast called Deep Talks, is made possible because of the generous support of listeners like you. I don't put advertisements in my podcast. I don't currently do a paid Substack subscription fee or anything like that. I make it all free. And as a result of that, I am completely dependent on people like you supporting this work on Patreon. And there are some extra generous supporters out there that I always like to mention as much as I can at the end of each episode. So extra special thanks to Jean-Marc, J. Tom, Aaron, Daniel, Dave, Eli, John Mark, Josie, Life Church, Matthew, Nick, Paul R., Rob, Sam, and Scott. Thank you all for your generous support. I can't do this without you. And until next time, we'll talk again soon.